Tell me about Richard.
He was the most charming person and amusing person I've ever met.
He was rather grand but gracious.
He was constantly fun.
He had two exactly matching pairs of glasses. They looked the same, but one was for distance vision and one was for short vision. So he kept swapping between them as he talked. He was a terrible name dropper.
He approached his writing much like he lived his life, unconventionally. When he wrote his novel, he didn't even decide on the order of the chapters until he was finished.
Some people do like to paint him as an eccentric, though. Why do you think that is?
I don't know. He was quite different from most people. He was very grand, not in a pompous way, but he had tremendous poise.
Wollheim's description of the way we see pictures has profoundly influenced our current research.
What's special about picture seeing, says Wollheim, is that it involves experiencing three-dimensional objects in two-dimensional surfaces.
And the account begins from the phenomenology of looking at a painting. Consider what it is like looking at a painting of a ship. Wollheim thinks this engages a natural capacity to see things in other things. So if we look at a stain on a wall, we might see a boy carrying a parcel, or if we look at the clouds, we might see a great Wagnerian conductor.
Wollheim's most successful contribution to the puzzle therefore involved shifting the focus of interest away from resemblance.
Philosophically, what kept him outside the mainstream was his commitment to the relevance of psychology, particularly psychoanalysis.
Wollheim himself did the best exegetical work on Freud.
How might that relate to his theory of expressiveness? Is there any connection that you see with what he's trying to do there?
In Wollheim's work, everything centers around the experience of the work of art. And that experience presents itself as a totality. And Wollheim is very well aware of that. So when you think about depiction or representation and expression, on the other hand, then Wollheim is aware that these two can't actually be separated in the experience. They belong together.
I realized it really did hang together under the surface in a way that one might not have been confident that it would.
This coherence under the surface might not be evident at first, but this systematic approach explains the way his theory of mind leads to a theory of complex projection at work in art making. And this idea originates with Wollheim, not with Freud or Klein.
No such notion occurs in Freud or Klein. It originated with Wollheim.
Complex projection, well, it really captured the imagination of those working outside of philosophy.
So amid these theoretical explorations, an intriguing project emerged. In recognition of Wollheim's wide, if unorthodox appeal, Louise Braddock has spearheaded a centenary program at St John's College, Oxford, featuring talks and an innovative exhibition of recent collage works by artist Patrice Moor.
Wollheim Centenary programs. So it's very intentionally a kind of combination of a psychoanalytic space of reflection on the one hand, and something which in a way quite ironically or humorously perhaps mimics Wollheim's own way of standing back and giving himself space when he engaged with a painting.
This event was designed to foster a space for reflection.
In other words, one tries to clear one's mind of any sort of prejudices or associations or expectations and stand back to try and understand what is present to one that one might then be able to engage with.
Most people are hostile to the idea that they have a vast conflict-ridden unconscious mind. They just don't want to believe that. They like to think they know their own minds.
Things that Wollheim stresses over and over again. The twofoldness starts when you see one shape or figure behind another. Mm-hmm. It's that sense of depth that really indicates that we're dealing with representation, with depiction. But it's precisely that represented depth, the space, the pictorial space, that I think, according to Wollheim, offers a very interesting psychological opportunity for expression, because the artist is now able to take this space, the space of the picture, and organize in it all kinds of elements.
Like he needs to first have the container, right? He's saying
Exactly.
depiction's your container.
Yeah.
Into which.
Yeah, container is also the right term to use. I think that is in his mind as well. So the idea that certain mental states or objects, it can also be people or elements, can be contained within a work of art, and where containment here is a spatial notion, makes painting just a very interesting medium, I think.
Lots of people philosophers in particular, are very uncomfortable with trying to accept his theory of expressiveness because they feel they have to accept too many concepts which they feel are unverifiable.
Well, first of all, a lot of it was dismissed. I mean, and remains dismissed in the sense that people come to the explicitly psychoanalytic bits and they turn away.
Wollheim is clearly very interested in psychoanalysis, as I think he thinks it's the best account of the mind that we have.
Can you talk us through a basic model of projection?
So projection is modeled on bodily functions. Mm-hmm. So if the body wants to get rid of something noxious, then you would vomit. Projection is a way for the mind to evacuate something onto something else into the external world, so that figure can then take on the projection. Perhaps just an ordinary example, you might be feeling angry, but at an unconscious level, you might not be aware of the fact that you're angry, but you experience the world around you as full of angry people. If one is angry, one experiences the world as angry. Klein also thought, though, that there was a positive element to projection, because we don't only project negative emotions onto the external world. We might also project positive emotions into the external world. And Klein thought that projection was a very, very early way in which infants tried to communicate with their mothers. If they had a positive emotion, they might project it onto the mother, asking the mother to hold it. Or if they had a negative emotion, they might project it onto the mother, asking the mother to take away the bad emotion, maybe replace it with something good.
So for Klein, the key to creativity is the overcoming of the depressive position, characterized by the desire to, quote, undo or repair the earlier fantasized destruction of the actual and internalized mother. Or, as Wollheim later put it, the reparative drive or the desire to establish whole objects.
Wollheim himself did the best exegetical work on Freud that anybody had done for a long time.
That's interesting.
And Wollheim actually distinguishes between different kinds of projection. So there's one account which he calls simple projection, which I think would be akin to the Freudian and Kleinian accounts. But then Wollheim says there's also something which he calls complex projection. Now, that's not a term that Klein or Freud use. Now, Wollheim says that works of art employ complex projection. What the artist does is she creates a work of art that will look to the viewer as though it is of a piece with the mental state that she is projecting. I think Wollheim does think that one of the ways in which works of art get their expressive properties is via this activity of projection.
Yeah.
But the artist does not mean to simply get rid of his or her emotions. What the artist hopes to do is, by expressing the emotion through the work of art, come to a deeper understanding of them.
Okay.
And I think that's the difference between art and neurosis. The neurotic doesn't want to engage with the painful emotions, whereas the artist wants to do something creative with them, wants to understand where they're coming from, maybe wants to transform them into something else. I think you're right that perhaps the word projection isn't quite right. I mean, even if complex projection has its roots in this more primitive defense mechanism of simple projection, I like what you just said, the Hegelian notion of being at home in the world, because I think it is in a way through projection that we are at home in the world. We feel the world resonating with us. And people who are, say, very, very depressed don't feel at home in the world. Now, I think there's a difference between what the artist is doing and what somebody who's projecting negative emotions is doing. There's a difference between just projecting and expressing, because expression might employ some of the techniques of projection, but not with the aim of getting rid of that emotion.
Mm-hmm. What would you say a Freudian-informed analysis of art appreciation gives us that other forms of art criticism miss out?
It gives you a vastly deeper sense of the author's intentions. The understanding of novelists has been obviously deepened by psychoanalysis, and I think people would accept that. But to think that the understanding of painting is affected by it requires you to switch genres in a way that very few people would be able to do.
Not much can be said about Wollheim's account of expression before you start using notions like projection. So the most you can say without mentioning anything Freudian is that just as we can find landscapes in the flesh to be emotionally coloured, so similarly we can find paintings or perhaps the scenes visible in them to be emotionally coloured.
I think it's in Painting as an Art, he says, there are some art historians that when they come to criticize paintings, maybe from a psychological perspective, employ a psychology that if they were to live by it in their ordinary lives, would have no friends or loved ones and would be at a loss to explain how they came about.
Okay. Is that unusual?
Absolutely. And lucidly, psychoanalytically informed. I mean, yeah.
Yes. Lucidly, unpack lucidly for me there.
Well, it's no good just saying such and such is the expression of an unconscious fantasy or something like that. You have to spell that out in a lot of detail for people.
The ambassadors.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
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 So tell me a bit more about that.
Well, that's a painting that you appreciate from a Freudian point of view because it's saying something at once about sex and death.
In the exhibition The Presence of Absence, Wollheim's philosophy of art and psychoanalysis comes together with the work of collage artist Patrice Moor. 2 weeks before Moor's second birthday, her mother died suddenly from a hereditary heart condition. Moor's collages set together family photographs, bodily images and stitching to compose works that both express and depict a consciousness of trauma before language.
Well, about 18 months ago, I had an email from Patrice saying that she'd been given my name as a philosopher who knew something about philosophy of psychoanalysis and of art. She had a collection of collages that she wanted to present as a collection in its own right, but with a commentary, a sort of philosophical psychoanalytic commentary. And then she came, visited and showed me some of her images. And it coincided with the time when my little research group was doing some quite in-depth work, I suppose, on Wollheim, on Richard Wollheim. And I saw a connection between some of Wollheim's philosophy and these images of Patrice's, which, although I didn't realize it at the time, was a unusual thing to have got hold of, because Wollheim doesn't, of course, write about collage at all. He does write about modern art quite a lot, but not about collage. So there's a kind of additional explanatory challenge here, or expository challenge, to find out more about how Wollheim's own philosophy of art, which is quite developed in some ways and quite heavily critiqued in some ways, how much that might generalize to something like collage. It devotes 2 chapters of The Thread of Life, pretty much, to what he's calling iconic mental states, which are fantasies, dreams, experiential memories, and effectively what he calls essential imagining, when we identify with somebody. Well, his study of these mental states is there to capture, is there causal power? The fact that if you are in the throes of a certain sort of memory, a certain sort of identification, a certain sort of fantasy, this will actually eventuate in actions which in some way do reflect the content of that state, but often in a very distorted way, and a very powerful way, and a way that it's very difficult to understand, to intervene in, and to deflect or to manage, certainly to manage rationally.
I've been doing collages for a long time, so that's probably, when I say a long time, probably 20 years, because I've always liked collages and because I'm very interested in the process and I'm very interested in surrealism. I've always been very drawn to surrealism and the stream of consciousness. I never could find what I wanted to do with them initially. It took me a long time to be able to sort of work with them. Suddenly, because I started doing things that were much more personal rather than ideas-led. And I think that was the key. I was very much in touch with my family in Holland through Zoom and various other means, probably more because of the lockdown as well. And then I asked them to send me family photos. And again, that was another springboard to more material, more ideas, and kind of furthering my ideas of what I wanted to do. Initially, I was going to use the actual photographs, that I felt upset at the idea of cutting them up. And then I realized that the whole process of photocopying the photographs kind of removed it. It created another veil between me and it created a kind of dreamlike quality, something that lent itself rather well to the feelings, and something out of reach, less graspable. And I think that, these are all thoughts that I've had subsequently, because at the time I wasn't really thinking, I was responding to things and then making and making and making. And I think there was a huge amount of making. And now it's all the things I'm saying are really looking back on it, but not things I was thinking necessarily very consciously at the time. And I found also the process of cutting very therapeutic, very pleasant, very easy. And by having a whole pile of cuttings in front of me, I would kind of find things that went together that I hadn't thought of before. But I think that the whole thing is very unconscious, because often I think I've said this to you before, I make collages when I'm talking to people on the phone or doing almost not thinking. And the not thinking seems to promote the work in some way. So there's a huge amount of unconscious decisions that are made. That the sewing is a form of repair work that does feel very much like I'm repairing something.
You mentioned Louise Bourgeois in connection with the needle. Yeah,
that Louise Bourgeois said the needle was an instrument of repair or something like that, and I really feel that. So it's a business of cutting and disconnecting things, then reconnecting and making new connections, and then the sewing seems to be like the fine. Well, the bottom part of the jaw is missing.
This bit, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the bottom, my skull doesn't have a bottom jaw.
No.
So that it kind of creates a very different feeling, indeed. Yeah. And I mean, I see all sorts of things in that skull, which, because I've worked with it for so many years, sometimes it looks to me like a child's face. It almost looks like that to me. Other times it looks to me like, a woman's face. But it is easier to kind of, because it's missing the bottom jaw, it's kind of easier to be just like a representative of something rather than something very specific. There is a playfulness about making the collages. I think I've got the dominant ones are the obvious. They're Frida Kahlo, Louise Bourgeois, and Tracy Emin, in terms of being the subject of the work and through the work being able to process difficult emotions and one's relationship with life.
But what you've just been saying makes me think, among other things, of Richard Wollheim, the philosopher whose work, your work immediately brought to mind. And what you're saying there is, interestingly, echoes or reflects or is resonant with his preferred method of looking at a painting, which was to sit and look at it for a very long time. The exact length of time reported varies from between 1 hour and 3 hours, but it's a sort of legend in the literature that he would sit there, and he describes how he waits until a lot of unnecessary things have dropped away, and he becomes much more aware of something in the painting, which is a feeling of something like connectedness, I think.
Do you have a sense in which the hastiness, which some of that was thrown out, should be reconsidered? If so, how might we bring it back in?
I think it is too hasty to conclude on the basis of logical problems or apparent circularities that this theory is not a good theory. Because I think also, if you read Wollheim's work, he's fairly happy to tinker at the surface. And to change a concept here or there, to articulate it in a way that makes it more accessible to his colleagues.
Saw someone burning the entire works of Richard Wollheim. What would you reach in the fire to save?
Oh, That's a good question. I mean, I guess the stock answer would be painting as an art, but I like my philosophy a little bit more intensely philosophical than that. So maybe I'll make a very strange choice and choose on persons in their lives.